Have you ever wondered what the very first humans thought when they looked at a towering tree rising alone in the middle of an endless landscape? Imagine that moment, millions of years ago, when an ancestor with limited language but a growing mind stopped, stared at a massive, ancient tree, and felt something stir inside. What force could make early humans, still fighting for survival, pause long enough to sense a presence larger than themselves? This is where the roots of spiritual consciousness begin to take shape in moments of silence that reshape the path of human evolution. When primitive minds first recognized patterns in nature, they were not just identifying danger or shelter. They were touching the earliest forms of symbolism, the beginnings of meaning. A single tree, resistant to storms and droughts, could feel like a messenger of something invisible, yet powerful. Its branches reaching upward mirrored a desire humans would only later understand: the urge to look beyond the material world. The sacred did not start with temples or rituals. It started with raw perception, with the shock of realizing that the world might be speaking through signs, shapes, and forces far older than any tribe. As early humans gathered food, protected their young, and moved through unpredictable terrains, this silent encounter with a tree that seemed eternal pushed their minds into unfamiliar territory. Suddenly, existence was not only about hunger, danger, or movement. It was about connection, about searching for intention in the wind, meaning in the shadows, guidance in the unspoken. You have probably felt something similar at least once, that strange moment when nature seems to whisper directly to you. You already know how powerful that is. Now imagine being one of the first humans ever to feel it. And because understanding these origins changes how we see ourselves, let me know if you have ever experienced a moment like this. Leave a comment sharing your own impression of nature speaking to you, and do not forget to like the video and check if you are already subscribed to the channel, because what you will discover next may surprise you. This is only the beginning, and the next insight flows naturally from this awakening that shaped the earliest human consciousness. As the first glimmers of spiritual awareness unfolded, early humans began to notice that certain shapes in the landscape stirred emotions they could not yet name. The towering Ngao, sacred tree, with its roots gripping the earth and its branches stretching into the unknown, became more than a physical structure. It quietly evolved into a symbol that blended fear, hope, and survival into a single powerful image. At a time when predators, storms, and hunger dictated every step, finding something that seemed immune to chaos triggered a new layer of perception. It invited ancient minds to believe that some forces were stable, protective, and enduring, even when everything else shifted unpredictably. In those early ages, humans lived close to danger, and every decision they made could determine the fate of their group. Yet the presence of that immense tree created a pause in their restless movement. It offered shade in scorching heat, shelter from rain, and a vantage point that allowed them to watch the horizon. Gradually, this practical value merged with an emotional response. They began associating the tree with continuity, as if it held a quiet memory of all the seasons it had survived. Something that had stood for so long seemed capable of witnessing their struggles, and this perception awakened a desire to trust in forces beyond immediate understanding. The symbol grew stronger when generations returned to the same place and recognized that the tree had not changed. Grandparents pointed it out to children. Hunters marked its bark to measure time. Mothers brought their newborns near its roots, feeling an instinctive comfort in its presence. Over thousands of years, the tree stopped being just a part of the environment. It became a reference point for emotional stability, a silent companion in moments of uncertainty. Even in eras before spoken stories emerged, meaning circulated around it through gestures, rituals, and shared memories. What truly transformed this symbol into something sacred was not simply its size or longevity, but the way humans projected their own inner world onto it. The desire for protection, the fear of the unknown, the hope for continuity, all intertwined with the tree's enduring form. It became both mirror and guide, an anchor that reminded them they were part of something larger than their daily struggle for survival. And as this symbolic connection deepened, it opened the door to the next transformation, where instinct began turning into belief, and the sacred slowly shaped the earliest foundations of human spirituality. As the symbolic weight of the sacred tree expanded across generations, early humans began looking at it with sharper attention. They recognized that the massive trunk, marked by cracks, textures, and layers of age, held information they could not yet articulate. Every line in the bark seemed to tell a story of storms endured, droughts survived, and seasons repeated without end. This perception awakened a curiosity that was no longer driven only by survival, but by interpretation. They started noticing patterns, shapes formed naturally by time, and they sensed that these markings carried messages more enduring than spoken sounds. The tree's trunk became a kind of prehistoric archive. Hunters traced the grooves with their fingers, trying to understand whether they represented warnings or guidance. Elders studied the darker and lighter tones of the bark as if reading a silent script. Even children felt drawn to its surface, following the natural spirals that seemed to echo cycles they instinctively recognized. These encounters were not isolated moments, but the beginnings of a shared cognitive shift. The early mind started to grasp that meaning could exist beyond immediate physical events. The world was not just a series of reactions, it might also be a source of signs. What made the tree's trunk so captivating was the slow realization that its markings were not random to the human eye. Certain shapes resembled the silhouettes of animals. Others seemed to mimic the movement of rivers or the arcs of lightning. Primitive groups started linking these natural forms to their daily experiences, interpreting them as reflections of the forces they depended on. Each time a new pattern appeared after a season of heavy rains or harsh winds, they saw it as evidence that the tree was responding to the world just as they did. This subtle mirroring created a psychological bridge between human experience and natural transformation. In those early millennia, without structured language or formal belief systems, interpretation became a collective act. A group might gather around the trunk, pointing at marks and sharing impressions through gestures, expressions, and instinctive sounds. Over time, these shared understandings became the seeds of symbolic thinking. The tree was no longer only a symbol of endurance. It had become a messenger, a recorder of events, a witness that communicated through its evolving form. This realization deepened the spiritual bond forming between humans and the natural world, preparing their minds for an even greater shift in awareness that would reshape how early families perceived protection, danger, and the unseen forces guiding their existence. As the meaning carved into the ancestral trunk grew more complex, early humans began to associate the tree not only with memory, but with protection. Families who lived near it felt a strange reassurance, as if the tree's presence formed an invisible boundary between them and the dangers that stalked the open plains. Predators that moved freely through the grasslands rarely approached its immediate shadow, perhaps deterred by scent, wind patterns, or instinctive caution. But for humans, this distance seemed intentional, almost purposeful. The tree appeared to guard them, and this perception reshaped their emotional relationship with the landscape. Mothers often positioned their children near the wide roots, believing the massive trunk offered safety from unseen threats. Night fires were built close to its sheltering form, and hunters returning from long treks felt grounded the moment they saw its silhouette against the sky. The tree had become more than a structure. It was a refuge, a defined place of belonging in a world that rarely gave them certainty. Over time, this sense of protection evolved into something deeper. Humans began attributing intent to the tree, imagining that its strength was not only physical, but also spiritual, a silent guardian whose presence carried meaning. This shift was profound, in an era before spoken. Myths, belief emerged through behavior. Groups started performing small rituals around the roots, perhaps placing stones, feathers, or shaped bits of wood as offerings. These gestures were born not from formal doctrine, but from gratitude and an instinctive desire to maintain the bond. When storms raged or lightning struck nearby, families clung to the tree's base, convinced that its towering form could shield them. And when danger passed, their attachment grew stronger. The tree's endurance became a metaphor for survival itself, and this idea slowly spread through migrating groups who shared the memory of their sacred protector. As the generations accumulated, the tree became a central figure in the emotional lives of early families. Its reliability contrasted sharply with the unpredictability of nature, and this stability nurtured the first seeds of collective spirituality. Protection was no longer seen as random. It felt guided, intentional, connected to something that watched over them even when they could not understand how. And this expanding belief would gradually shape the rituals, behaviors, and meanings that defined early human consciousness, creating the foundation for a more structured spiritual identity that awaited them in the ages to come. Before we continue, share your thoughts in the comments. What does the idea of an ancient protective symbol evoke in you? Your perspective helps deepen this exploration as we move forward. As early humans deepened their connection with the sacred tree, it gradually became more than a place of protection. It evolved into a reference point for critical decisions, especially during periods of uncertainty. When storms gathered on the horizon or distant roars warned of predators approaching, groups instinctively looked to the tree to determine their next move. Its stability in an unpredictable world made it a natural compass, shaping choices that often meant the difference between survival and loss. Families gathered near its roots not only to seek shelter, but also to observe changes in the surrounding landscape, trusting that the tree's enduring presence could help them interpret the dangers ahead. With time, patterns emerged. When winds shifted violently, hunters noticed how the tree bent without breaking, teaching them how to endure rather than flee. When the sky darkened, its branches offered clues about where lightning might strike or how water would flow across the land. The tree became a living map, a silent mentor offering guidance through its reactions to the world. Even subtle details like the behavior of birds nesting in its canopy or animals circling its perimeter contributed to decisions about when to migrate, when to hide, or when to stand their ground. These observations formed a primitive system of knowledge, merging instinct with interpretation. This reliance on the tree for direction marked a turning point in the development of symbolic thinking. Instead of reacting blindly to fear, humans began to anticipate events, believing the sacred tree could signal what was coming. The way its leaves shook in certain winds, the cracks that deepened in its trunk after long droughts, or the moss that grew on its shaded side became indicators imbued with meaning. These natural signs shaped their actions, transforming the tree into a guide that bridged the gap between the physical world and the mysterious forces they sensed but could not fully understand. As communities grew and memories accumulated, the tree's role expanded from practical guidance to emotional assurance. Even when groups traveled far from its presence, the lessons learned beneath its branches continued to influence their choices. They carried its image in their minds, recalling its resilience during times of danger. This internalized symbol acted as a stable point of reference in an ever-changing environment, reinforcing the idea that meaning could exist outside immediate experience. And as these early interpretations took root, they paved the way for a deeper spiritual framework in which symbols, rituals, and shared stories would become essential to the collective identity forming across generations. As the sacred tree continued to anchor the lives of early humans, its influence extended beyond physical guidance and protection, shaping the emerging framework of collective belief. Groups no longer perceived the world solely through immediate survival needs. They began to recognize patterns, assign meaning to events, and interpret natural phenomena as messages linked to their lives. The tree became a focal point of these early interpretations, a tangible presence that symbolized forces beyond their comprehension. Its permanence inspired a sense of order, and in witnessing its resilience through storms, droughts, and seasons, humans began internalizing the idea that some aspects of existence were governed by invisible rules, perhaps even by intentions they could sense but not yet articulate. This transformation in perception was gradual. Individuals who observed subtle shifts, the bending of branches, the change of moss, or the arrival of specific animals, started to connect these signs with outcomes in their daily lives. Over time, these associations were communicated through gestures, shared glances, and primitive sounds, laying the groundwork for storytelling. The sacred tree acted as a teacher, embedding lessons in resilience, caution, and hope into the consciousness of the group. Even in the absence of formal language, the collective mind of the tribe absorbed these experiences, building an early shared understanding that some forces were protective, guiding, or just beyond reach, yet fundamentally important. As these interpretations accumulated, they coalesced into the first forms of collective belief. The tree was more than a physical landmark. It became a symbol of shared experience and communal understanding. Early humans developed rituals around it, subtle acts like placing stones at its base or arranging small objects along its roots, gestures that reinforced the group's connection to something greater than themselves. These actions were not yet codified as religion, but they represented the initial human impulse to recognize and honor forces larger than the individual, to create a shared spiritual context that could strengthen bonds and guide communal life. The emotional resonance of these rituals deepened the psychological imprint of the tree, turning observation into reverence. Through these early spiritual interactions, the sacred tree catalyzed a cognitive expansion that bridged instinct and reflection. It helped humans form concepts of continuity, protection, and unseen influence, all of which became central to the development of social cohesion and cultural identity. By embedding meaning into a single, enduring natural feature, early humans initiated a process of abstraction that would later allow for the creation of more complex symbols, myths, and beliefs. The spiritual imprint of the sacred tree set the stage for the next evolutionary step, the transmission of these beliefs across generations, solidifying the roots of early human spirituality and guiding emerging practices that defined the social and psychological landscape of prehistoric communities. As generations passed, the sacred tree became more than a guide or a source of protection. It became a repository of emotional memory for early humans. Families who lived and moved around it developed a sense of continuity that transcended individual lifespans. The resilience of the tree mirrored the resilience they needed to survive, and its permanence offered comfort in a world defined by uncertainty. Grandparents who had watched storms batter the landscape would tell stories to their grandchildren about the tree's endurance, imbuing these narratives with awe and reverence. Each act of remembrance strengthened the emotional weight of the tree, transforming it into a living symbol of collective experience. This emotional resonance was subtle but powerful. Humans are wired to respond to cues that promise safety and stability, and the tree became a silent anchor for these instincts. Its presence evoked a complex blend of fear, respect, and hope, emotions that were interwoven into the fabric of early human life. Rituals, gestures, and repeated behaviors reinforced these associations, creating shared experiences that bound the group together. The tree's shadow provided solace during long, uncertain nights, and its branches offered markers for orientation and timing, anchoring not just physical but emotional rhythms. Through repeated exposure to this symbol, early humans began to internalize the idea that some forces in the world were enduring, protective, and sacred, fostering a nascent sense of spirituality. As the emotional significance of the tree spread, it influenced social structures and communal cohesion. Families who respected the sacred symbol were more likely to cooperate, share resources, and teach survival strategies effectively. The tree became a silent mediator, shaping behavior in ways that strengthened the collective resilience of early groups. Its influence extended beyond direct interaction, as the mental image of the tree, carried in stories and gestures, continued to guide decisions even when people were physically distant from it. This process laid the groundwork for abstract thinking, memory, and symbolic communication, all of which were essential for the formation of more complex cultural and spiritual systems in later epochs. The lasting emotional impact of the sacred tree highlights how early humans began to weave natural elements into the tapestry of meaning that structured their lives. It was not just survival that was at stake. It was the development of a shared sense of purpose and identity that transcended immediate threats. This legacy would ripple through generations, influencing perceptions of the sacred, the divine, and the unseen forces that early humans believed guided their existence. Now, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. How do you feel about the idea of an enduring symbol shaping human emotion and collective memory? Your reflections help us explore the depth of these ancient connections as we move forward to the next stage of early human spiritual evolution. As early humans reflected on the sacred tree and its enduring presence, they began to notice subtle signs in its environment that seemed to communicate beyond words. The sway of its branches, the texture of its bark, the seasonal changes in its leaves, all of these details were interpreted as messages from forces larger than themselves. Without written language, humans relied on observation and instinct to understand the world, and the tree became a focal point for these silent interpretations. Each nuance was a clue, a symbolic element that guided their behavior and helped them navigate both the physical and emotional landscapes of survival. Groups started to develop practices that were consistent but not yet formalized, placing stones around the roots, leaving small tokens from hunts, or arranging plant materials near the tree were acts born from observation and repetition. These gestures were more than decoration. They were expressions of understanding, a form of communication with the unseen. Each action reinforced the significance of the tree and the lessons it symbolized. Early humans were not only reading the environment, they were creating a dialogue with it, embedding intention into every gesture and establishing patterns that would eventually form the basis for ritual behavior. This early symbolic thinking also strengthened group cohesion. Shared interpretations of the tree's signs encouraged cooperation, ensured that knowledge about safe paths or fertile grounds was passed along, and subtly instructed younger members about the values and priorities of the group. The rituals themselves were not rigid doctrines, but adaptive behaviors that allowed humans to respond effectively to threats while also maintaining emotional equilibrium. Over time, these practices became internalized. Even when individuals were alone, the memory of the tree and its associated rituals guided their choices, influencing how they perceived danger, opportunity, and the unseen forces they sensed in the world. The silent interpretations around the sacred tree demonstrate how cognition and spirituality intertwined in early human life. By observing, responding, and embedding meaning into natural phenomena, humans laid the groundwork for more structured forms of belief, creating a mental framework in which abstract thought and symbolic action could thrive. Each ritual, though primitive, reflected a growing awareness that survival depended not only on physical prowess, but also on understanding and engaging with forces beyond immediate perception. This emerging spiritual literacy would prepare the way for increasingly sophisticated cultural practices and belief systems, extending the influence of the sacred tree into realms of thought and behavior that shaped the trajectory of human consciousness for millennia to come. As early humans continued to engage with the sacred tree, they began to realize that their interactions were affecting more than immediate survival. They were reshaping perception itself. Observing the tree, interpreting its patterns, and responding to subtle environmental cues cultivated a capacity for abstract thought that had not existed before. The sacred became a lens through which humans could view their world differently, connecting cause and effect across time, recognizing cycles in nature, and imagining forces that were invisible yet influential. This marked the beginning of a cognitive expansion that would eventually support symbolic communication, planning, and shared belief systems. The tree's influence extended into the conceptual realm. Humans started to link events that happened under or around it to larger narratives. Storms were not just weather, hunts were not merely sustenance, and the growth or decline of resources was seen as part of a broader pattern. In doing so, they began to perceive a web of relationships between themselves, the environment, and unseen forces that seemed to govern outcomes. The sacred tree, as a central, enduring presence, acted as a stabilizing reference point for these emerging connections, giving shape to thoughts and ideas that were previously fleeting or unarticulated. This process of consciousness expansion was subtle yet transformative. Families learned to anticipate outcomes based on observation, to encode knowledge into shared practices, and to transmit these understandings across generations. The symbolic weight of the tree fostered attention to detail, patience, and reflection, encouraging humans to consider not only immediate action, but also long-term consequences. It was through this kind of sustained engagement with a sacred symbol that the earliest humans developed the cognitive architecture necessary for culture, planning, and spirituality. The sacred tree, then, was more than a physical landmark. It was a catalyst for mental evolution. By mediating the interplay between perception, interpretation, and behavior, it allowed humans to conceptualize patterns, project intentions, and engage with abstract forces that could not be directly observed. These emerging capabilities laid the groundwork for ritual, storytelling, and eventually the construction of religious and philosophical frameworks. The expansion of consciousness initiated by such symbolic interaction was subtle yet profound, shaping how early humans understood their place in the world and their relationship to forces that, although unseen, were undeniably real in their experience. The influence of the sacred tree prepared the mind for the final stage of this spiritual evolution, where the lessons, symbols, and emotional bonds formed over millennia would consolidate into enduring traditions and a collective sense of the divine. As the sacred tree continued to anchor early human experience, its influence extended far beyond immediate survival, shaping a spiritual legacy that would resonate across millennia. Families who once gathered under its branches began transmitting stories, behaviors, and lessons to their descendants, creating a thread of continuity that connected generations. The tree's presence became a symbol of endurance, guidance, and unseen protection, instilling an early understanding that life was governed not only by observable forces, but also by subtle, intangible influences. These concepts, rooted in observation and emotional response, became the foundation of ritual, symbolism, and eventually the structures of organized belief that define human culture today. Through repeated engagement with the sacred symbol, early humans developed mental frameworks capable of abstract thought, pattern recognition, and shared meaning. Children learned to interpret cues from nature, to respect the cycles of growth and decay, and to act with an awareness of consequences extending beyond the immediate moment. The rituals surrounding the tree, placing objects at its base, marking the passage of seasons, or simply observing its stability, fostered cohesion, memory, and communal identity. Over generations, these practices consolidated into traditions, and the lessons embedded in the sacred tree became encoded in the emerging cultural consciousness. It was more than a physical presence. It was a mental and spiritual compass guiding perception, action, and interpretation. Even as humans migrated and landscapes changed, the symbolic and emotional resonance of the sacred tree persisted. The principles learned through interaction with it, resilience, observation, protection, and connection to forces beyond comprehension, traveled with them, influencing how communities approached life, danger, and the unseen. This legacy laid the groundwork for mythology, early religious thought, and the abstract representation of the divine. By internalizing these lessons, humans created a continuity of meaning that spanned time and space, linking past, present, and future in a shared spiritual understanding that would inform the evolution of belief systems for millennia. If you followed this journey with me, take a moment to leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Maybe you feel a connection to these ancient practices or see how symbols shaped human experience in ways still relevant today. Make sure to like this video if you found value in understanding how early humans perceived the sacred, and check that you are subscribed to continue exploring these incredible stories. There's a video right beside this one that complements these insights, so click over and continue the journey with me, discovering how the first humans interacted with forces that shaped their consciousness and left a spiritual legacy we are only beginning to understand.